introduce our next speaker, and he'll be speaking on corporate ethics and the new capitalism. And please welcome Chairman of the Catholic Foundation, Mr. Willie Cheng.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My talk today will be on a corporate response to the crisis of ethics in business. I realize that technically I've only got 7 minutes to finish this. So I'm going to try and cut short and save you all some time, right? But can't be done in 7. Okay, so I'll try and provide some perspectives on what seems to be a renewed emphasis on business ethics, and in particular discuss two related trends. You all might have noticed that there seems to be a resurgence on the importance of business ethics and ethical conduct in the corporate world. So EcoVadis, shown there, is a sustainability rating agency. In its latest index, it said that business ethics is the most improved CR theme globally. Similarly, the Institute of Business Ethics, which annually reviews the research in this area, came to about the same conclusion. And corporate ethics was the theme of a whole issue of the publication by the Singapore Institute of Directors recently. So is this a good or a bad thing? Well, if you look at it positively, you can say that tomorrow is going to be a better and brighter world where companies are trying to do the right things. But the pessimist will say that this focus on right and wrong stems from the realization that things have actually gotten pretty bad. There's actually another way of looking at this resurgence, which is consider that the focus on ethics by corporations is coming from two directions. One is a focus on corporations not doing wrong, and the other is a focus on corporations doing the right things right. This focus on not doing wrong stems primarily from the spate of corporate scandals that arise from the unethical conduct by corporations and their executives. So those of us who have been around for a while, the two largest scandals in corporate annals were Enron in 2001, followed by the WorldCom crash a year later. In both cases, shareholders lost billions of dollars. Unfortunately, since then, there continues to be one scandal after another, some big, some small. Probably one of the world's biggest scandals is being played out right now with the 1MDB court case up north, right, where billions of dollars have been missing from Malaysia's state fund. And we, hear daily of how Optimus Prime and the big whale have been operating. Even in Singapore, with our squeaky clean reputation, we have had our fair share of corporate scandals. In 1985, we had a Pan-L crisis where the stock market was closed for 3 days. In 1995, the merchant bank Barings collapsed as a result of a rogue trader who lost $1 billion in derivative trades on Cymex. And then, not too long ago, Singapore was hit a number of corporate scandals involving S-chips. S-chips are Chinese companies which are incorporated offshore but listed on the Singapore Exchange. And those were hit included China Aviation Oil, China Housing Sports, Honghui Technologies. And of course, just not so long ago, last year, some 17 former current and former executives of Capital Corporation, right, and its offshore marine units were investigated for bribery charges involving Capital Offshore and Marine in Brazil. Now, the immediate response of the authorities on major corporate scandals is to seek out the culprits and punish them. Then they try to enact new regulations to plug the gaps and avoid similar occurrences in the future. In the case of Enron, several of the company's executives were jailed. The two people that you see in the photos are Andrew Fastel, the CFO, and Jeffrey Skilling, the CEO of Enron. Interestingly, Andrew Fastel is now having served his jail term, going around the world speaking about his time at Enron. One major outcome of Enron was the enactment of the US Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002. That act sets new standards for public accounting, firms, corporate management, and boards. After the Pan-L crisis, 3 key people in the company were convicted of criminal breach of trust and jailed. Changes were made to the Singapore Companies Act in 1989. We now have audit committees and system of internal controls for public companies. All this became mandatory. And post-Barings, there were extensive changes made to the Securities and Futures Trading Act. So in recent years, I noticed that there has been an increasing tendency by the regulators to severely penalize companies for misconduct. So the table that you see there shows the companies that were fined in 2018 by US authorities. Many of them are actually financial institutions who have breached AML or anti-money laundering regulations. And the $4.9 billion paid by Royal Bank of Scotland actually pales in comparison to the $28 billion that Volkswagen has paid so far for what they did with the defeat device in the diesel engines. And it seems to me that in the last year, there's now new thinking among the regulators around the world that just penalizing the companies is not enough. They now want to hold the senior executives responsible, personally accountable for any breach in the regulations. So just a few months ago, MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, came out with a set of guidelines on individual accountability and the conduct for financial institutions in Singapore. But in many respects, all these measures may just be band-aids because the law will always be playing catch-up. For example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act brought in very sweeping new regulations for boards, management, and auditors. But that failed to prevent the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008. And the ensuing global financial crisis led to another set of regulatory reform, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. In Singapore, the Companies Act had undergone several rounds of significant amendments, the most recent being in 2014. And the Asian financial crisis led to the formation of the Singapore Institute of Directors and the issuance by MAS of a corporate code of corporate governance. And that code has been changed 3 times now, with the latest one being made only in last August. At the individual company level, many boards and senior management are responding by putting in place policies and controls to discourage, to prevent, to detect, and to penalize any wrongdoing. So a common measure that many companies do is to adopt a code of conduct and ethics. This sets the board's tone from the top of the ethical principles that govern the company's decisions and behavior. So a typical code normally provides guidance for handling issues such as harassment, safety, and conflicts of interest. And most companies implement a comprehensive system of internal controls and risk management. And they normally have what is called several lines of defense, comprising different layers of checks and controls. And some companies go further to establish a whistleblowing policy and mechanism. And it's because studies have shown that significant proportion of frauds and irregularities are actually prevented or uncovered by whistleblowers. Without question, a focus on not doing wrong is probably too narrow. First, it is not possible to identify all the out-of-bound areas that are wrong to step into. Worse, by defining them, it appears to make permissible areas that should be out of bounds, but have not yet been defined to as such. And in truth, there's a lot of gray areas. So I mentioned that Andrew Fastow, the ex-CFO of Enron, is now out of jail and giving a talk around the world, right? He was in Singapore recently. I attended his talk. And he said that the financial engineering that he did at Enron was legally permitted by the rules at that time, even though he knew it was morally wrong. So in his talk, he held up a trophy in one hand and said that he received this CFO Excellence Award in 1999 for his financial engineering. Then he held out a card, a prison card in the other hand, and said that 2 years later, he went to jail for doing exactly the same thing, for his financial engineering and innovation. Interestingly, Fastow also remarked that in his view, the rules of Sarbanes-Oxley and the subsequent rules that came about are not going to prevent a lot of other Enrons, which he sees are in the making, and that there will be corporate time bombs that he predicts will be going off in the future. So the law and the rules will always be catching up as each new area of malfeasance manifests itself. And as you can see, The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was followed by the Dodd-Frank Act only 6 years later, and will likely not be the last piece of US legislation enacted to deter corporate conduct. So in a recent forum at the Singapore Institute of Directors, Professor Walter Woon argued that more prescriptive rules is not equal to good governance. He said, in fact, companies can be paralyzed by rules. Too many rules can inhibit the consensus, but they do not obstruct the unscrupulous. In other words, it is actually more useful to focus on doing right rather than doing wrong. Not doing wrong is like this list of thou shalt not from the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. Consider the greater impact of Jesus' teaching to do the right thing. Love your neighbors as you love yourselves. To my mind, doing right stakes the higher ground for corporate morality. It is far more effective and energizing in the long run than simply avoiding not doing wrong. Mr. Lim Boon Heng earlier quoted Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, right, who said that legislation can only punish and deter, right? But what you really need is for people to have the urge to do the positive and right thing. Interestingly, this focus on doing right also comes from the detrimental consequences that corporations are causing at a macro level. Much of the ills that are associated with the adverse effects of modern capitalism and globalization are driving this thinking. We have ills like irreversible environmental damage, rising income inequalities, exploitation of labor, disrupted jobs, increasing unemployment. So the list can go on. Pope Francis shone a spotlight on some of these ills in his encyclical, Evangelii Gaudium, or Joy of the Gospel. Pope Francis criticized the economy of exclusion and inequality that we're currently living in. So as an example of exclusion, he asked, why is it news when the stock market drops by 2 percentage points, but not when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure? And for inequality, he asked, how can we stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? In his encyclical, he expressed doubt on the trickle-down economics. The theory is that economic growth in a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. And Pope Francis said that this opinion of trickle-down economics has never been confirmed by facts. And in his view, the theory is based on a very crude and naive trust in the goodness of those who are wielding economic power and what he calls the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. So meanwhile, he said, look at the excluded who are still waiting for your trickle-down economics to work. So Pope Francis instead has set out a vision of what he calls a virtuous capitalism. A capitalism where economic and social activities are based on virtues of compassion and generosity. And he urged for an economic philosophy which is premised on individual generosity, community and family initiatives. And for public policies which are focused on the legitimate redistribution of economic benefits. Pope Francis is not the only one who holds a vision of a better tomorrow for capitalism. Across the board, political leaders, consumers, social entrepreneurs, academicians, thought leaders, and even business leaders are calling for a rethink of how corporations should work. And many have proposed their own versions of how capitalism can and should be transformed. Like Thailand's King Bhumibol during his lifetime, he set out a philosophy of what he calls the sufficiency economy. Just be sufficient. No need to maximize profits. Optimize it. Michael Porter of Harvard University speaks of creating shared value. Some of you would have read of. Stephen Young of the Core Roundtable writes of moral capitalism. And he posits that virtue is an extension of interest rightly understood and don't conflict with economic interest. And John Elkington of Wollons introduced a breakthrough capitalism program to achieve system-level changes through several leverage points. And I think many of you would have recently read of the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of our corporation. The Business Roundtable is an association of the CEOs of nearly 200 America's most prominent companies. And in 1997, the Business Roundtable declared that the paramount duty of management and board is to shareholders, which is in line with Milton Friedman's declaration, as you've heard earlier on this morning. The revised 19th August 2019 statement actually ditched the focus on shareholders and proposes that a company has a broader responsibility to society, and it has to consider all stakeholders in its business decisions. So, at a conceptual level, this new and changing worldview of capitalism is actually in direct contrast to the traditional capitalism championed by Milton Friedman with the mantra of maximizing shareholder value. And at the core of this new capitalism are two key distinctive characteristics. The first is that companies should meet the needs of not just shareholders, but also the greater group of stakeholders, including customers, suppliers, employees, the community, and the environment. And the second key distinctive characteristic is that companies and the people who run them should focus on values and not just value. Values as in human and community values, and not just value as in profits and economic value. At the ground level, such thinking is translating into new models and ways of doing business. It's impacting both how corporates operate as well as new forms of companies being created. So let me just cover each of these in turn. I think you'll be no doubt familiar with corporate social responsibility or CSR programs, which many companies are engaged in one form or another. In the past, CSR programs tend to be by the way, standalone, and quite narrowly focused on corporate giving, either corporate voluntarism or corporate philanthropy. Now, with the greater issues of climate change and community concerns, many companies are taking CSR to a different level by embracing social and environmental impact in their core business. And the leading example of this is arguably Unilever. And some of the companies in Singapore that I would consider leading the way in CSR here and sustainability would be companies like DBS and CDL. The next level of CSR is often known as sustainability agenda and the sustainability movement. Sustainability is about how a business creates and sustains value over time, the short term, the medium term, and the long term. The chart you see there is a triple bottom line concept developed by John Elkington, and the three bottom lines there are people for social impact, planet for environmental impact, and profit for economic value. Today, many jurisdictions around the world are requiring their companies to produce sustainability reports. The Singapore Exchange mandated sustainability reporting for listed companies on a comply-explain basis from 2018 onwards. Companies are generally required to report on how they're engaging with their key stakeholders and addressing the risks and opportunities in what is called the ESG factors, E for environment, S for social, and G for governance. Now, in the year 2000, the UN set out 8 Millennium Development Goals. In 2016, UN replaced that with 17 Sustainability Development Goals to be achieved by 2030. Goals such as ending poverty, reducing inequalities, and achieving gender equality. Some countries have driven their sustainability efforts off these goals. In this new capitalism, a new type of hybrid organizations called social enterprises is emerging. In simple terms, these are businesses with social missions. The diagram there shows that social enterprises sit at the center of a spectrum with the traditional non-profit or pure charity on one extreme and the traditional for-profit or pure commercial company on the other extreme. So social enterprises have dual missions, business profitability, and a social mission. And often the social mission involves employment of beneficiaries and profits going back to the community. The Center for Social Enterprises, or RACE, estimates there are some 350 social enterprises in Singapore. And examples of these local social enterprises include RSV, ProGuide, EcoSoft, Dialogue in the Dark. Dialogue in the Dark is one where the blind will take you on a tour in the dark. They will turn the tables on you. We, of course, have our own Catholic social enterprise, Crossings Cafe at Catholic Centre at Waterloo Street. Half the staff there are beneficiaries and persons with special needs, and all profits go to charity. So, if you've not been there, you should. They need your support. Now, similar to social enterprises is a group called inclusive businesses. These are enterprises that focus on providing goods and services to low-income communities. The low-income communities are commonly referred to as the bottom of the pyramid, or BOP. So, C.K. Pralhat, in his book, Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, popularized this idea that there is value that can be delivered to those at the bottom of the pyramid and value that can be gained for businesses in operating in that space. So right at the bottom now, there are about 2.7 billion people that earn less than $2.50 a day. And in his view, there is still money to be made there. So an inclusive example of inclusive business is Sunny Shop, which was established by the World Toilet Organization. A Singapore NGO, what they do is they do a franchise model where they supply toilets that are made by local masons to local sales entrepreneurs to sell to poor communities in developing countries like Cambodia, India, and Africa. So a more well-known example of inclusive business there is Grameen Damon, which is a joint venture between Muhammad Yunus Grameen Bank and Group Damon, a commercial yogurt maker. So the venture brings affordable nutrition to malnourished children in Bangladesh using fortified yogurt. Another manifestation of this new capitalism is the emergence of impact investing. It's the active placement of what is known as patient capital into social enterprises and inclusive businesses. The general idea is that you don't necessarily maximize the financial returns, but you try to achieve a balance of social and financial returns. This interest in impact investing has led financial institutions to create impact investment funds. And the current estimate is that global impact investment market is worth over US $500 billion. Corporations also are beginning to make impact investments. Traditionally, some large companies have engaged in corporate venture capital, where they invest in portfolio companies to drive both financial and strategic returns. Some of the companies are now extending the investment concept to corporate impact venturing, where social and environmental impact are part of the metrics for measuring success in the venture. So one example is IKEA, which has created a company called IKEA Green Tech, which invests in green technology firms to help IKEA go renewable in its core activities. Increasingly, government, non-profit, and business spheres, which are traditionally separate, are actually collaborating and coming together for greater social and environmental impact. Gil Bullock at Accenture calls this the convergence economy. His book provides several examples of these collaborations. In the interest of time, let me just cover one. Refugees United. In Uganda, Ericsson, which is a communications equipment maker, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and the Clinton Foundation came together to create a service to reunite refugees using mobile phone technology. So that venture, called Refugees United, was done with MTN, a mobile operator in Uganda. So in summary, I'll just say that the resurgence of ethics and morality in business is positive. It is perhaps inevitable that our flawed human nature will result in occasional individual and corporate wrongdoing and ensuing scandals. Scandals which in turn will lead to more legislation and rules to prevent us from not doing more wrong. However, the greater hope is that a call for a more moral and compassionate capitalism will lead companies and the world towards a brighter future, and towards a collective mindset that focuses on doing the right things right for the collective benefit of us all. Thank you.